Once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this IT Learning Hub webinar, Getting at Pedestrian and Bicyclist Exposure from 3 Different Approaches. This webinar is being presented as part of a series partnership with the National Travel Monitoring Exposition and Conference, or NATMEC. Bicycle and pedestrian exposure data are needed to help contextual crash data and determine crash rates. Without the crash rate based on reliable exposure data, it is difficult to understand and accurately determine if the crash increases are due to more people on the road or other factors. The first presentation today will summarize efforts to launch a statewide pedestrian and bicyclist monitoring program at TxDOT and provides a foundation for one approach to institutionalize the collection of this exposure data. Second presentation exemplifies how big data can be used to create an exposure map of bicyclists in San Francisco and show that the number of crashes and the number of people bicycling is needed to understand which corridors actually have higher risk through crash rates. And then finally, a unique type of pedestrian exposure is described through data collection efforts to determine the extent of pedestrian trespassing events along railways in North Carolina. And the learning objectives for today's webinar are to become familiar with different program strategies and elements used to implement a statewide pedestrian and bicyclist monitoring program. Understand how location-based service apps combined with machine learning can differentiate transportation modes to identify bicycling activity. And to recognize how estimating the universe of pedestrian trespassing along railroads provides a more complete picture of exposure than the limited strike data available through the Federal Railroad Administration that only represents crash events. And at this time, I would like to introduce our presenters for today. We have Sean Turner, who's the Senior Research Engineer for the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Sean Coe is the Director of Special Projects for Streetlight Data. And Sarah Searcy is the Bicycle and Pedestrian Program Manager for the Institute for Transportation Research and Education. And at this time, I would like to pass things off to our first presenter today, Sean Turner.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Kellyanne, and hi, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about pedestrian bicyclist monitoring in Texas, but in particular, I'm going to focus on the Texas DOT or TxDOT monitoring program that TTI has developed and supported for the past 4 or so years. So I'm going to give a quick glimpse of where we started back in 2016 when TTI first got started in the TxDOT monitoring program. Then I'm going to fast forward to where we are today and some of the different program elements that we have in place and 1 or 2 of the things that we have planned for the near future. And then throughout my presentation, I'm going to sprinkle some of our lessons learned throughout the presentation. And here's my first lessons learned. As the saying goes, it takes a village, and we most certainly had a village of people and agencies that are or that have been involved in this effort in the past 4 years. And so I just wanted to acknowledge those folks that have been sort of in our village of bike and pedestrian count data in Texas. And in particular, I wanted to thank a few people and acknowledge a few people. Terry Kaplan at Texas DOT, she was the statewide bike and pedestrian coordinator, and she really believed in the importance of this data initiative and helped get it launched. And Bonnie Sherman, also of Texas DOT, she is now the statewide bike and pedestrian coordinator, and she has supported and she's really grown this initiative to something that's much greater than I thought it would ever be. And finally, I want to acknowledge Phil Lasley. We like to call him Dr. Tableau, if you've heard of the Tableau visualization suite. He's kind of been my faithful and very energetic lieutenant, and he's now leading a large part of our effort, which includes the statewide database that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So here's a snapshot from 4 years ago whenever we first got started on this with TxDOT. So it was primarily cities and MPOs that were collecting the bicyclist and pedestrian count data, and they were using the typical tools of the trade. They had using inductance loops and pneumatic tubes for cyclists and infrared sensors for pedestrians. And so we did a short survey of the cities and MPOs, and we asked and we heard from them about sort of what would you like TxDOT to do? And so they wanted TxDOT to help with a few specific things. They called out peer exchanges and identifying and providing best practices. Several of the smaller cities and MPOs were asking whether TxDOT could buy some of the counter equipment and then loan it out, sort of essentially like a counter equipment library. And several also asked about a statewide data clearinghouse. They were interested to see what was happening in other cities in the state. And so not surprisingly, some of this input really set our agenda in the coming years in terms of developing and then implementing a pedestrian and cyclist monitoring program in Texas. So as I've mentioned, we've been at this for about 4 or so years. We started in the fall of 2016, and Terry Kaplan and then Bonnie Sherman, they've been pretty creative about finding support for the program. So it started as a single research project, but after showing some early successes and after making friends with the project manager in TxDOT's research office, we were able to get some additional research funding to expand our original project and also to add several other elements. And then TxDOT's research office, they also have a separate pot of money for implementation and training, and so we were creative and we put in a separate request for more money out of this implementation and training category. And so once we had the statewide database stood up, we then moved to using an interagency contract for TTI in order for TTI to help provide the technical assistance and support. So I don't have it specifically listed here, but I think this is another lessons learned is be creative and ask around for support. I would say your own pot of money should be your last resort. If you haven't heard of SPR funds, especially if you're in a DOT, SPR is statewide planning and research, and that's essentially what pays for motor vehicle count data collection. So I'm going to mention a little bit more about integration with traditional data collection in the next few slides. And so here are some of the major program components as of 2020. And so I'm going to go through each of these 5 major components and talk a little bit about those in the next 5 or 6 or so slides. So the foundation of our program is what we call the Count Exchange. It's essentially our statewide database. And this is, I've joked with him, this is Phil Lasley's baby, and we're very proud of his baby, but we're only getting started. We're going to be adding some more functionality, and we're going to continue to add lots more data in the coming years. You may have already seen a presentation or two on this, but here's the link. You can check it out after the webinar. It is a public access database. Our Count Exchange really relies on active participation and contributions from local agencies. Again, it takes a village. We can't just rely on one particular agency to do it all. And so recognizing that many of the cities and the MPOs were collecting data, we created this contributor portal that makes it easy for these agencies to import common data formats of their bike and pedestrian counts into the Count Exchange. And so as you might expect, you have to set up an account to get into the contributor portal. But if you're interested, just contact me or contact us later, and we'll be glad to give you a tour inside of the portal and basically show you the different steps that we have set up to get data imported. Here's my second lesson learned is make friends with the DOT folks who have been counting cars and trucks for decades. They have a ton of experience, maybe not necessarily in counting bicyclists and pedestrians, but in collecting counts, and they have resources. And I think ultimately the bike and pedestrian counting should be integrated with their car and truck counts rather than a separate and distinct thing. But the thing that you should understand is that the DOT traffic monitoring folks, they may initially be reluctant or hesitant. I mean, I know for a fact that they're asked to do more and more with fewer people, and they have various constraints and hurdles. In some cases, they may have FTE caps, and even if they have SPR money to spend, they can't hire anymore because of these FTE caps and just other hurdles that may be in their way in terms of adding more to their plate. And so in our case, we were coordinating with the planning division, and we were talking about integration in the long term. But in the short term, we were really trying to get this monitoring program set up and get it a little bit better established before we would turn it over to the planning division as the ultimate repository and having ultimate ownership for that. Like many DOTs, TxDOT also licensed Strava Metro data and made it available to sub-licensees within the state, which is essentially the MPOs in the cities. And quite a few of them signed up for that access. I think one of the hurdles, as you see here, I don't know if you've seen, but Strava Metro has this new interactive interface. It's basically, it's an online tool, makes it a lot easier to manipulate and summarize their data than before, when you had to deal with these very large geo databases and you had to know GIS. And I think most people that have worked with Strava or know about Strava really understand that it's most useful when it's expanded and it's adjusted to reflect total bicyclists and not just the Strava samples. And so, I mean, even early in our program, whenever we were looking at Strava, we saw that the sample rates in Strava, they can be widely variable, right? I mean, on some non-recreational routes, we were seeing less than 1%, whereas on highly recreational routes where there were lots of people using Strava, we were seeing sample rates of 50% or higher. And so you can come up with some misleading results if you just use Strava samples, and especially in places where there's lots of people riding bikes but not necessarily recording them as Strava trips, like, say, university campuses. I mean, we certainly saw it here where we've got 60,000 students and probably, a quarter of them ride bikes on a regular basis. So what we did was we used the available permanent counters that we had to develop an expansion and adjustment process such that we could estimate total bicyclists. And you can see some of those formulas there, but if you're really interested in more detail, just ask Google to show you the TTI report 6927-P6. This was another program component. This was something that several of the small cities and MPOs really, they asked for. It's like, hey, we can't afford to buy this equipment. We only need to use it maybe every once in a while. And so can TxDOT do something about that? And so we helped set up this equipment loan program. And so you can see there we've got 10 infrared counters for pedestrians, 8 pneumatic tube counters, and TxDOT's essentially making it available to not only the districts around the state within TxDOT, but also other local agencies and others as available, right? If TxDOT or the cities aren't using them, in some cases the universities that are doing research for TxDOT can use these counters. I should also mention that 2 of the larger MPOs in the state, Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston, they also have counter loan programs. And so we were really trying to knock down that hurdle of, well, we don't have the equipment, so we can't count. As I mentioned before, one of the other things that we did to sort of to speed up the implementation is we focused and we got some specific funding specifically for training and trying to provide the resources and make it easy for locals to learn best practices. And so TxDOT's research office, they were pretty happy with the work that we were doing in the research project, and so they were generous in providing more money to support this training statewide. We had planned in-person training around the state, and that was actually the beginning of 2020, but then COVID hit in late February, early March. We had done one on-site training, and and we hit pause for a couple months, but eventually moved the training online. And so we did 3 different online training modules, and I will say that we probably got, well, I know we got more attendance at these online training than we could have hoped for in person. So we tried to make lemonade out of some lemons. Plus, we were able to record the training, and we now have this permanent resource page on the TxDOT website shown here. So we've got the training modules, but we also specifically recorded some tutorials that we weren't able to do in the in-person training, like how to do best practices for setting up equipment and getting the equipment started. One other thing that we did, and we did this a few years ago, is knowing that we were going to be collecting short duration counts in addition to having count data year-round, we took a look at the permanent counter data, and we came up with some initial groupings for seasonal adjustment groups. Essentially, if you're not familiar with that term, seasonal adjustment groups are ways to take, if you collect bicycle and pedestrian counts in a specific month, a seasonal adjustment allows you to annualize that count. It could be, and it typically is the case, that counts are going to vary throughout the year. There may be more people biking and walking during more favorable weather conditions, and so you'll want to adjust that to get average annuals, and that's a standard practice in car and truck monitoring. And so we took a look at our permanent counter data, and we came up with some initial groupings for these seasonal adjustment groups. However, at the time that we did this, I think it was probably about 2 years ago, most of the existing locations that had at least 1 full year of data, they were from shared use paths, and they were on shared use paths in Central and North Texas. And so we didn't see very distinct groups like we expected to for, say, commuting and recreation, and sort of a hybrid or a mix between commuting and recreation. And this chart shows the count levels by month. And so you can see, though, that we do have different patterns for cyclists and for pedestrians. And so what this tells me is that, at least in Texas, cyclists can still get enough ventilation in the summer months to keep going. I mean, right? So the activity levels are actually increasing during the summer months for cyclists, whereas we see a little bit of a drop in the pedestrians, which is the blue line. And so with this initial grouping that we had for the available counters, we essentially came up with 2 groups, pedestrians and cyclists. And so these are the adjustment factors that you would apply to a short duration daily count estimate from a particular month. And so again, I should say this is really only a preliminary grouping. We haven't applied this to short duration counts yet. We're actually taking another look at this right now, in fact, and we're using a more sophisticated cluster analysis. Again, trying to borrow techniques from what's been developed for car and truck monitoring, and we're trying to include more data from more diverse sites, not just the shared use paths. And so that's where we are right now. Let me just mention an effort that's going to be happening in the next year or so. And so Bonnie Sherman, again, she's the statewide bike and pedestrian coordinator. She's been very persuasive within TxDOT and has gotten some funding to support additional statewide data collection, which includes both permanent counter installs as well as short duration counts. So we're going to be working with her in earnest on this over the next year. I don't think we're going to double the number of permanent counters that we currently have, but we're going to add significantly to the number of permanent counters. But we're also going to try and fill in gaps, and we're going to try and fill in gaps where count data hasn't been collected before, especially with these short duration counts. So that is, I guess that's the overview of our program. Just a couple, I want to reiterate a couple of the lessons learned and mention a few other things that I think are really important. The refresher, it takes a village. Don't try to do it by yourself. Pool resources, work together, coordinate, collaborate, share ideas. Get folks excited about this. Number two, make friends in your DOT traffic monitoring program. They've been doing this for decades with cars and trucks. They have expertise, they have tools, and in some cases, they will lend resources. Just recognize that they might be a little bit overwhelmed at first in terms of taking on some new and unfamiliar processes. Here's another one that I wanted to mention. Publicize early successes. So we got the chance, I mean, we were doing regular briefings to folks in TxDOT and other partner agencies, but we had the chance and we took it to brief TxDOT's Deputy Executive Director, basically the number 2 in charge at TxDOT. And so we did this presentation on the impacts of COVID-19. It was a very topical thing. And there was, I mean, we had seen things in the media, people were interested, and so they wanted to know more. We were able to say, look, we've been working on this program over the past couple of years. Here's what we can say about biking and walking within Texas during this very trying time. The other thing that we did is, so we put together this video summary, and I have to thank our communication staff at TTI. We've done a lot of stuff over the past 4 years. We have this fancy Count Exchange website. We have a resource page. We got all this technical info, but it's really important that you distill the basics of what you're doing into a simple video. The slides are going to be shared. I was going to show this, but I'm running out of time. But you can click on this and you can see a short 4-minute video summary of our initiative. It's really important. Don't forget the big picture and communicating the big picture of what you're doing. Final thing, time and patience. I would say this came from my colleagues at TxDOT and others on the TTI team. They said, you know, it really does take time and patience. We've been working at this for 4 years. We had some hurdles and challenges along the way, but we tried to get multiple agencies involved, and we tried to get different departments within TxDOT involved. We had a number of people that supported us at TTI, and we also had help from an on-site consultant at Jacobs at TxDOT. So those are our lessons learned. And so Kellyanne, I will turn it back to you if there are any questions.
Thank you, Sean. We will hold questions till the very end after all the presentations today. So we'll go ahead and continue on to the next presentation. And the next presentation is by Sean Coe. So Sean Coe, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Great. Thank you, Kellyanne. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys today. Unfortunately, we can't all be in person, but yeah, this is the best that we can do. But I think we've got some really exciting stuff to talk about today. So I'm Sean Coe. I'm the Director of Special Projects here at Streetlight Data. I'm a transportation planner. I used to work at an MPO and was a consultant, so I'm quite familiar with all the types of count methodologies that have been around. So today, I'm just going to talk about our data a little bit, and then just a couple things about COVID, because that's always on everyone's mind, and then talk about the bike exposure metrics and some of the exciting stuff we've been doing, and then we'll talk about questions at the end. So we get our data from billions of mobile phone pings, both from phones and GPS navigation devices all across the US. We then take all those pings and we determine the probability that each one of those pings is a particular mode. So we look at, you know, is based on how the ping acts, is it a walk, car, bike trip, or is it stationary? And stationary means that if it's stopped, then then we sort of break the trip, and then the trip continues on, and we observe what that ping is doing. We also look at geospatial features to help determine the mode. So, the presence of infrastructure on the ground, proximity to parks and main roads, and then, what does road network and block network look like? So we do that to avoid mode confusion with slow-moving transit vehicles or vehicles in congestion in order to determine if it's a bike trip or even a walk trip in some dense cities. And then we take that data and we match it up with the best known available data sources, such as the National Household Travel Survey. We've looked at other state travel surveys as well to see how it matches up with self-reported known distances for bike trips. So you can see here that we tend to pick up a lot of shorter trips, which is based on our methodology of how we pick up the pings than the Household Travel Survey, which makes sense because if you think about how those are reported in surveys, you can then forget about, like, say, the walk or bike trip if you're trip chaining to go to transit or something like that. Okay, so I threw in a couple things related to COVID just because I think initially, at least when this all happened and we saw VMT plummet, I was sort of thinking, wow, well, maybe this is great because I'm not seeing many cars on the road, but I'm seeing a ton of people walking and biking more than maybe I've ever seen during the sort of day hours, and thought, well, this could be great. Maybe we're going to reduce the big dent in bicycle and pedestrian collisions and fatalities. Like, maybe that's like a positive thing that came out of COVID. So I think that data is still being analyzed because it takes, depending on where you live, can be a year lag to get the collision data. But we are really interested in to say, well, what is the bike miles traveled? So that's the trip times the trip length times the distance among CBSAs in the U.S. from May of 2019 to May of 2020. And like in the prior slide that Sean was talking about, and if you've just been in your communities or try to go by a bike shop, you've just seen tons and tons of people bicycling. So that is in fact what we observed, but in some cases we saw that some of the trips actually went down, so there may be more activity. However, some of those trips are maybe shorter or they're sort of decreasing. So then we looked at Portland and to see, again, from May of 2019 to May of 2020 to really see where those trips were decreasing or increasing. So in the metro area, you can see that the downtown area has a lot of trips that are decreasing, while sort of the outlying areas, you can see trips increasing over the same period. And then we looked at, what does the count data say? So this is along the Hawthorne Bridge. You can see that this is sort of when most of the shelter-in-place orders happened around March. You can see that those trips going into the area dropped significantly, and it was pretty steady decline, even in towards the end of March and then April. So that seems to make sense. So maybe people aren't commuting just as they aren't in vehicles, and Portland has a pretty high mode share. So if all modes are dropping into the downtown area, of course bikes would be represented in that, but then other maybe recreational trips are occurring in other places or places that people weren't historically biking have seen an increase. So in terms of exposure, as Sean was talking about, it's very difficult to do a count program, just if you were starting from scratch, or if you do have one, there's like a lot of issues in terms of getting the equipment, installing the equipment, calibrating it, and it's, you know, on a citywide level, there's very few cities that do that. So in San Francisco, they actually have, you know, one of the larger citywide programs in the U.S. Their counters are, you know, distributed all along the city, but they really only have, you know, about 75 of them. And then of those 75, the data quality is, you know, not fantastic depending on when, you know, it's being looked at. So it's a really great start, but there's millions of trips, you know, each day, of course, pre-COVID. So, you know, how would the city know where trips are occurring if there's no counters available? So we took a look at the virtual coverage using big data by deploying our virtual sensors, which are pings we get from phones, and we looked at every mile of roadway, bike lane, park lane, to see, you know, where these trips are occurring, and the darker lines indicate there's more activity in these areas. Golden Gate Park, which has been a big customer of ours, has used the data to analyze visitation to the park. So you can really see like a bigger picture, you know, and I think the one thing is there are definite gaps in San Francisco's monitoring system, and, you know, they are aware of this and are working on it, but you can see that there's some activity occurring in some of the areas where there's no counters now. So what would that look like with collisions? So here in California, as with many states, there is a lag in getting the collision data, but UC Berkeley SafeTrack has done an excellent job of taking all that collision data, and they geocode it and make it available to anyone to look at. So what we did was we took all the collision data in San Francisco and, you know, just took that output from SafeTrack, and we mapped out you know, where those collisions were. So this is between 2015 and 2018, San Francisco saw, you know, more than 1,400 reported bike collisions. So that's a lot of, you know, either geometric changes that need to be fixed, other issues, and San Francisco does an excellent job of working with their public health department to really try to reduce these collisions. But again, so where does, you can see that there's a lot of collisions happening, but you know, where should you prioritize those fixes? So we took all that bike activity and put it against the crash locations, and the yellow is the higher exposure, and the sort of purplish is the lower exposure levels. So there are areas of the city where this is Market Street for those who are familiar with San Francisco, where there's a ton of bike activity, and, you know, there are a lot of crashes, but you would assume that, you know, that is potentially, you know, an unsafe corridor, and they're experimenting with different separated bikeway designs on Market. So it turns out it's relatively, you know, safe compared to other parts. And some of these other parts, which are, you know, lit up in yellow, have also been fixed. Like there's been separated bikeways out in these areas since, you know, when we last got this data. So, you know, that was an analysis that we did. Again, it is difficult to get the collision data. So we have partnered with Ford Safety Insights to really see, number one, how could you get your collision data into a platform that's easy to use, and secondly, how could we look at near miss, you know, behavior, which is really difficult to assess. When we look at the crash data, of course are only looking at the crashes that have occurred. And we look at property damage, we look at the type of injury, and then of course fatalities. But looking at situations that potentially could be avoided is kind of a really, really big valuable tool for planners to look at what is happening on the roadway. And Ford does that by looking at their connected vehicle data, so looking at hard braking events, lane departure, meaning that they're swerving, and then the crash data, which they will take from a jurisdiction and then put into the database, and then use the countermeasure data from the CMF clearinghouse to look at what, based on this type of behavior, what countermeasures could be implemented just on a, sort of sketch level. And then they take our data and look at not only the bike and ped data, but also the vehicle data, because, safety is a multimodal venture where if you just look at bike or ped data, it's hard to get the bigger picture. So this is just a quick screenshot of the Ford safety dashboard, and the red dots are where the collision data has been mapped out. And then they also have these hard braking events, which you can toggle on and off by looking at, what has occurred, at this particular intersection. And from there, we can then look at running an origin destination analysis using streetlight data to look at that particular hotspot, which I talked about earlier, which is there's a high number of collisions plus hard braking events. And then look at, what types of crashes those are, where are people coming and going to, so what are the origin destinations of pedestrians, and you can see where all the pedestrian trips that are passing through the intersection and understand where they're going and which intersections they'll need to cross in order to get to that crash hotspot. And then we could look at the zone with every road segment in the jurisdiction or study area, and then do a segment analysis to calculate the speed, travel time, and congestion metrics for any time period, day or day part. In this one example, we looked at the average speeds in the evening hours. So this was from Maine, Huron, and Miller, and looked at approximately 20% of the trips on the segment were driving in excess of 50 miles an hour. So, obviously looking at the posted speed limit is valuable, but when you observe, you can also look at the crash types by time of day, and you can see that, vehicles, I don't know what the posted speed limit is offhand, but 50 miles an hour is pretty fast on a, non-highway area. That, of course, speed could be a contributing factor in those types of collisions. All right, so that's all I had. I'll hand it back to you, Kellyanne, to take any questions that people might have.
Thank you, Sean. We will continue on to the next presentation for today, and we do have Sarah Searcy up next. So Sarah, you may go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Kellyanne. My name is Sarah Searcy. I'm the Bicycle and Pedestrian Program Manager at the Institute for Transportation Research and Education at NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. I will be sharing preliminary results from studies funded by the North Carolina Department of Transportation that examine and quantify pedestrian trespassing along railroad right-of-ways in the state through the collection and analysis of thermal video data. Trespassing is the leading cause of rail-related deaths in the United States. Nearly half of all railroad fatalities were trespassers for the 5-year period from 2012 to 2017. Between 2012 and 2017, the annual number of trespassing-related pedestrian fatalities increased 18%, from 725 in 2012 to 858 in 2017. This chart, created by Kurt Topol from the Chicagoland Rail Safety Team using Federal Railroad Administration or FRA incident data, shows the extent of the trespass problem in North Carolina, where trespassers represent the largest share of rail-related deaths in the state. The frequency of trespasser incidents has not experienced the same level of overall decline since 1975 as other types of rail-related incidents in the state. Any vehicle or pedestrian is deemed by the FRA to be trespassing if they are on the part of railroad property used in railroad operation and whose presence is prohibited, forbidden, or unlawful. This includes if they are in the railroad right-of-way, not at a designated crossing, or if they are in the railroad right-of-way at a designated crossing when the gates are down. A trespass incident occurs when a trespasser is struck or otherwise injured by rail equipment, resulting in a form being submitted to the FRA. The Institute for Transportation Research and Education is involved in ongoing research funded by NCDOT to develop a more complete understanding of the extent of pedestrian trespassing along the railroad network in North Carolina. This research seeks to better quantify and describe the universe of trespassing activities, including those events that do not result in injury or death, through the development and testing of fixed-based thermal camera systems. Thermal camera systems were deployed at a sample of trespassing hotspots along railroad corridors in North Carolina to determine a count of trespassing events for the data collection time periods and estimate trespassing frequency at the hotspot. Using these trespassing event data, models for estimating and predicting trespassing across the railroad network are currently in development. The data are also being used to develop profiles of trespassing activity by season of year, month of year, day of week, and hour of day for each hotspot location that can inform local level intervention strategies. Site selection was informed by a review of the most recent 5 years of FRA incident data, train crew surveys, input from NCDOT Rail Division staff, analysis of U.S. Census Bureau population data, and evaluation of desire lines and attractors near the railroad track using GIS. After sites were selected, a sampling plan was created to collect at least one complete week of 24/7 thermal video data at each site in each season for 1 year. Primary data collection was conducted using Axis thermal video camera systems with motion detection, remote data access, and local data storage. 2 camera systems were deployed for data collection at 5 sites in 2017 to 2018, and 3 camera systems were deployed across 6 sites in 2019 to 2020. The camera installation locations were chosen based on consultation with community contacts. The thermal video data were reviewed and reduced into trespassing events and their associated characteristics. Descriptive statistics were produced for the first round of data collection that occurred in 2017 to 2018, and predictive modeling is in progress based on the data collection across all 11 sites. The image in the lower right-hand corner shows the typical thermal camera system setup. And you can see the pedestrian that's been captured and detected through motion detection crossing through the right-of-way and across the tracks. Five locations on the Piedmont corridor from Raleigh to Charlotte, North Carolina were observed in 2017 to 2018. These locations from east to west were Durham, Mebane, Elon, Greensboro, and Salisbury. 6 locations outside this corridor were observed in 2019 to 2020 as we expanded our study to the wider railroad network. These locations were from east to west: Shelby, Gastonia, Charlotte, Raleigh, Lumberton, and Rocky Mount. The 11 locations are geographically dispersed across the state and represent small, medium, and larger-sized urban and rural communities with populations ranging from less than 10,000 to over 500,000 people. This map shows our study communities overlaid with the North Carolina Railroad Network and FRA trespasser incidents for the 5-year period 2013 to 2017. There were 205 trespasser casualties on North Carolina railroads over the 5-year period. For the remainder of the presentation, I will provide analysis results for our 5 observed communities on the Piedmont corridor. Analyses of the data collected on the wider network is currently underway and will be published in a final report by the end of this year. Across the 5 observed communities on the Piedmont corridor from Raleigh to Charlotte, North Carolina, we collected 358 days of thermal video, and trespassing events were captured on 82% of the days. The average number of trespassing events per day across the sites was 32. By site, Elon averaged 50, Greensboro 42, Mebane 32, Durham 18, and Salisbury 2 trespassing events per day. An analysis of the average number of trespassing events per day by month and year shows that most sites experienced only slight variation in trespassing volumes between months of the year. Of the 5 study locations, Elon showed the most extreme variation between months. This site is the most different from the other sites in the sample. It is located near Elon University, a mid-sized private university with an undergraduate enrollment of around 6,000 students in a town of less than 10,000 people. This site experiences the highest average number of trespassing events per day, which typically ramp up on the weekend during months when the university is in session. There is a clear decrease in activity during the summer months when the university is not in session. The sharp increase in events in February, an average of 145 events per day in 2018, can be correlated with university athletic schedules during basketball season, when large gatherings occur before and after games. Looking to the average number of trespassing events per day by day of week, we see again that most sites experience only mild variation in trespassing volumes between days of the week. Elon again is the outlier, with volumes increasing over the weekends and trespassing at its highest at night. Considering all data collection dates, 52% of trespassing events at the Elon site occur from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. This is compared to 14% at Greensboro, 9% at Mebane, 17% at Durham, and 25% at Salisbury. For most of the sites, most trespassing activity occurred during daylight hours, and volumes were generally consistent across the week and month to month. We hypothesize that most trespassing events captured by our studied locations are the result of people trying to reach their destinations through the shortest, most direct route. Across the 5 study locations, 97% of trespassing events involved crossing the tracks, compared to 3% of events that involved movement along the tracks within the view of the camera. The average time on the tracks for those crossing is less than 5 seconds. Nearly 40% of people were traveling in groups of 2 or more. We captured people traveling alone, in pairs, and in groups, adults and children, people carrying bags and bikes, walking dogs, and pushing strollers. Most people moved on their way. Some lingered. Very few stood around or sat on or near the tracks. At our outlier location in Elon, where most events happen late at night into the early morning hours, people regularly climbed the fencing on the north side of the tracks to cross just a few hundred feet from a designated crossing. People continued to climb the fencing in the months after it was converted from 3-foot to 6-foot fencing in the summer of 2018, with over 50% of the 118 recorded events captured on August 31st, 2018, the Friday after classes began, involving fence climbing. However, thermal video captured in the spring of 2019 showed a sharp decline in trespassing events at the location, indicating that the enhanced fencing was working as a deterrent. This location is unique because student housing and a student community center is directly adjacent to the tracks, and restaurants and shops are nearby. The grassy right-of-way appears to be used as a common gathering space. From our study at hotspots along the Piedmont corridor from Raleigh to Charlotte, key preliminary findings included: the magnitude of trespassing at hotspots along the corridor is much greater than indicated by FRA incident reporting and train crew surveys. Most trespassing events are short in duration and involve crossing the tracks rather than movement along the right-of-way. Variability in time of day, day of week, month of year patterns appear to be influenced by local environmental and population factors, such as the case at the Elon site where university academic and athletic schedules appear correlated with trespassing activity. The profile of the average trespasser represented in the event-based data may not be consistent with the profile as defined with FRA incident data, particularly when analyzed at the local level rather than as a regional or state level aggregate. Based on a national study of the characteristics of those killed in railroad trespasser incidents conducted for the FRA in 2013, the average age at death was 38, with 2/3 of the decedents between ages of 20 and 49. Those killed were more likely to be male and white. Our key project outcomes include data and tools to assist in identifying areas at high risk for trespassing based on empirical data, providing NCDOT with an estimate of the real frequency and characteristics of trespassing events along NC Railroad right-of-ways that do not result in injury or death, and providing evidence to citizens, enforcement agencies, and policymakers on the concerns of trespassing to inform educational initiatives and countermeasures. We are currently in the process of developing predictive models using the trespassing event data collected at the 11 total study locations on the North Carolina Rail Network and additional secondary contextual data. We will be publishing our findings in a report to be completed by the end of this year. Thank you very much. Back to you, Kellyanne.
Thanks so much, Sarah. We'll now move on to our Q&A period of this webinar. So if you have questions for the presenters, please go ahead and type those questions in. We do have several questions to get us started. The first question is for Sean Turner. Sean, this participant states that their county employer currently contracts vehicle counts. Their question is, is there specifications for contracting local bike, scooter, and ped counts, and have they been developed and available?
Sure. First, if this is the Brian Burke that I know, I just want to say hi. I think it's been a few years since we crossed paths. We worked on some data stuff. But anyway, so yes, there are specifications. I think some of those are probably just very, very simple, as in, hey, go out and count bikes and peds. I think what we're trying to do in some of our stuff going forward is we're trying to write the specifications in a way such that we get as accurately as we can. And so I know that some of my colleagues here on the webinar, Sarah Searcy and Sarah O'Brien, they've done that in North Carolina. We've borrowed some of their specifications. We're looking at it and we're sort of adapting it for what we want to do in Texas. So, but I think that's important, not just for the short duration counts and going out and counting when they're out there counting cars and trucks, but also for permanent counters. Like if you're doing roadway improvement projects and you're going to be tearing up part of the road, or you have the opportunity to fit in permanent counter equipment, it's a small part of the overall construction cost.
Thank you, Sean. The next question here is for Sean Coe. Sean, the question is, what percentage of the vehicle fleet is represented by the Ford data?
So that's a good question. So what Ford tells us is there's 1 million connected vehicles on the roads that they're getting the data from. And they've also told us that every new Ford vehicle from 2020 forward will have the connected tech on board.
Okay, thank you. This question is for Sarah. Sarah, this participant states that their city parks in Ann Arbor, Michigan have trails that cross railroads. They ask, is this considered legal or is it just a problem?
If the trail is crossing the railroad track at a roadway and there's a designated crossing, then that is a legal crossing. But if there are desire lines that are crossing through the right-of-way and over the track that are unofficial, more than likely that crossing is illegal. It needs to be a designated highway, rail, at grade intersection in order for it to be a legal crossing for a pedestrian or a cyclist. we see that quite a bit. One of our locations is in Lumberton, North Carolina, and the GOAT Trail or Desire Line goes across the railroad track where a greenway terminates at the roadway. If you were not to take that shortcut, you would have to walk about a quarter-mile up the street to the official crossing and then back down a quarter-mile to reach the other connection point to the greenway. So again, what we're seeing is, folks very reasonably, very naturally, they want to take the shortest path, the most efficient path if they're walking or biking. And in many cases, this railroad track, it can be a barrier if we're defining, the ability to make that short crossing as an illegal activity. And for me personally, this research has shown that it's everybody that's engaging in this behavior, and the behavior in most cases is motivated by a need to connect to a destination.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Sean Turner's question is for you. This participant states that you did recommend to make friends with the DOT traffic monitoring folks and that there are also challenges they face. The question is, what's the status of the integrating bike and ped count data with automatic traffic monitoring data in Texas?
Yeah, so I think the latest is that the planning division, it's called the Planning Programming Division, they, I believe, are going to be putting out an RFP soon to add several different features to their existing traffic monitoring software, and one of those features is going to be the ability to include bike and pedestrian counts. And so I don't know how long the procurement takes. I would guess maybe within the next year or so, we would probably be talking about integrating the count exchange into the planning division's official count database.
Okay, thank you, Sean. We have this next question here that any of the presenters can feel free to contribute, but we will start with Sean Turner. So the question is, do you design a bicycle or pedestrian facility based on seasonally adjusted counts?
Yeah, so the short answer is it depends, but typically I would say you don't design a bike or pedestrian facility based on counts because really that's kind of like trying to determine where you build a bridge based on how many people are swimming. More often than not, you design a facility based on the type of street, the street context, how much traffic, how fast are the traffic moving. But I will say in general, though, in terms of when you use seasonally adjusted counts, it depends on whether you want to provide an annual average or whether you really want to provide, say, a peak, right? So if you're designing or if you're trying to figure out whether to separate pedestrians from cyclists on a shared use path, you would probably not take an annual average. You would look at your counts during the peak to determine the critical design period.
Thank you, Sean. Would any of the other presenters like to contribute? All right, we'll keep it moving. So this next question is actually for Sean Coe. This question is referring to the San Francisco cyclist exposure map. They assume that the bike volumes are based on Streetlight's data based on the device pings. If so, has Streetlight validated its bike volumes against the bike counter data? And where is this data if available?
Yeah, so great question. So we have done that. We looked at all of the counter data and checked it for data quality as well. We then took all of the data which we thought was high quality data, like such as there weren't spikes in the data or there was nothing picked up for a couple months, and then did a regression analysis both on weekend and weekday and found a really high correlation between our data and their data upwards, depending if it was weekday or weekend of, about 0.9, so pretty high. And then in terms of where you can get that, I think it's on our website, but if you don't, just email me and I'll send that to you.
Okay, that would be great. Thanks, Sean. This next question here is for Sarah. Sarah, they state that in North Carolina, was there any attempt to determine how close the trespassing occurred to an actual designated crossing, or how far apart designated crossings were? Also, is there a plan to use the hotspots of trespassing to install better pedestrian crossings there?
Yes, so when we go to do the modeling, we are including a variable that denotes the proximity of the nearest designated crossing. And just to give you some examples from our study locations, for instance, Elon, which featured prominently in my presentation, the nearest designated crossing is only approximately 400 feet away from where we were observing. In some instances, for example, in Durham, and there were 2 crossings near to the location where trespassing was prevalent, and each was about 200 feet away. And in contrast, in Greensboro, the nearest designated crossing is over a third of a mile away. And what we see as a desire line across the tracks is really connecting a residential neighborhood to the main sidewalk entryway into downtown Greensboro. So there's definitely some variability there in terms of whether access is being restricted. But again, this idea of this shortest path to the destination is a very common theme. The missing piece is the voices of the folks who are engaging in this activity. It's a really important piece of the puzzle as well. We were very interested, if we can, as a part of tech transfer, if we can go back into these communities and learn more from people about their decision making and ways that we can use this information to help improve access and connectivity and accessibility to the pedestrian population. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Also, just a follow-up question to that. At Elon University, do they talk to the students at the orientation at the beginning of the year? Are there other programs that they do try to educate the students on the dangers of these railroad crossings?
Yes, so it's against the student code of conduct to illegally cross, and one of the main motivations for replacing the fencing to adjust it so it was higher fencing was to help deter this known issue. We hypothesize most of the activity is happening when the sun goes down, so folks aren't making it apparent that they're trespassing in the light of day. But I would say from some of the clips that we've reviewed, it's a very dedicated subgroup of students that, they like the place where they're crossing, going a few hundred feet up to cross at the designated safe spot. They're really not motivated to do this. And again, the location we're observing, there's a community center just off of the right-of-way, and it was very common for large groups to gather in the evening time, these large social gatherings, and for that right-of-way space to be treated almost like a park-like space. So it's a very unique site amongst the total group, just with the proximity of the university and kind of the normalization in a way of being close to that track and being close to that right-of-way. And again, mentioning tech transfer, we're really hoping that we can take some of these data and these results back into these communities to help inform efforts to educate and to make folks aware that there's better choices that could be made, especially when in an area where the crossings are well spaced and there's opportunities to cross safely.
Great, thank you, Sarah. This next question here is for Sean Turner. Sean, does TxDOT use any of the piezoelectric sensors besides infrared or pneumatic?
So yes, TxDOT uses piezoelectric sensors for their car and truck counting and classification. We haven't used it much, if at all, for bicyclists yet.
Thank you, Sean. For Sean Coe, this participant asked, have you collected data, or has the collected data been available to the general public, and how has the data been used in terms of providing information to service users?
Yeah, so we our data works with a subscription to the platform, and we've done projects in almost every state, which in those states it's either been through consultants that work with public agencies like city, county, MPO, DOT, or we've worked directly with those people as well. So, you know, the data has been used for a variety of projects, you know, from turning movement counts to, you know, speed, origin, destination. And then in addition, we do have an academic license where we have academics get access to the data for free, and then they run analysis and you know, can sort of write up the results of their findings, and that's typically shared with anyone who's interested.
Thank you, Sean. Sarah, this question is for you. This question states, could you detect gender or age from the infrared cameras that were posted?
So for the thermal camera systems, they have a viewing range of up to 900 feet. And as you can imagine, the further away a pedestrian is captured from the camera field of view, the more difficult it is to discern features. So in some cases, we were able to differentiate, for instance, a child from an adult. It's a more, I think, more difficult just based on normative cues to differentiate between genders. And you know, those two attributes are not attributes that we prioritized in our coding of the video clips, but we did have a notes field that coders could use to capture, you know, general you know, interesting characteristics, including whether a child was present or whether somebody was carrying an object or carrying or riding a bicycle. But because we wouldn't be able to consistently code other characteristics such as age or gender, we did not prioritize that in this research.
Thank you, Sarah. This question is for Sean Turner. Sean, have you experienced any roadblocks in creating a counter loaner program in terms of permitting and contracting?
Yeah, so we're just getting started with the TxDOT program, but based on the experience from the two other NPOs, I wouldn't say there are roadblocks. I would say there are probably challenges and hurdles, but they're not insurmountable. So one of the things is basically the logistics of getting big tubs of equipment to different agencies, particularly around the state. I know that's something that we sort of had to work out the minutia of being able to do that and get that to people that needed it. One of the other things that we've noticed in some of the other loaner programs is there's sort of this there's a bias towards, yeah, I'll use the equipment, but then at the MPOs, they've bought some equipment and they've had, in one case, they haven't had extreme demand for it. And I think part of that is that in some cases, there's a high turnover rate with city staff, and so a new person comes in, they don't know how to use the equipment, if they could borrow it. And so that's part of the reason why we created that online training, so that even with staff turnover, hey, here's the training for this type of equipment, go look at that, and you should be up and running.
Thank you, Sean. This next question is for Sean Coe. This participant asks, has your data been used for equity analysis yet? Example, high collisions and exposure, poor bike and ped networks, or environmental justice areas. And is there any specific work that can be shared with the audience?
Yeah, good to see that question from Sam. Hi, Sam. So yes, we've done equity analysis. Because of the data is on a map, we can look at if you have your own measures of equity, which like in the San Francisco Bay Area we have what's called communities of concern, which is by race and income, and you can look at where those collisions are occurring or where there's exposure. Secondly, we can run trips and look at, if you're looking at an origin destination, look at, say, the traveler attributes. So those are the attributes of where the demographics of where the device rests within a zip code, and it's pulling the demographics not from the individual, but from the demographics of that zip code from the 2010 census. So we can look at income and race, family status, and then look at where those types of sort of who in aggregate is making those types of trips by the demographics. And we've got a lot of examples, so I can share that with you directly, Sam, or with anyone else who's interested.
Great, thank you, Sean. That does look to be all the questions that we have here today, but I will go ahead and give it about another minute in case anybody in the audience has any further questions for these presenters. And if not, we'll close out, but I'll go ahead and give everybody about a minute. But just to see if any more questions follow up, we're going to go ahead and ask presenters, what would be like one last thing that you would like to share with the audience today as kind of your final lesson learned to share? We'll start with Sean Turner. Sean, are you there?
Sorry, I forgot to take myself off mute.
No problem.
This is something that I've been thinking about as Sean Coe was presenting after me. But one of the things that we're looking towards, even in the TxDOT program in the coming years, is transitioning to something that is more crowdsource based. And so we've even talked about, well, do we need to be putting out more counters? But I think ultimately we do need to be putting out more permanent counters, because ultimately that's what we need to sort of expand any kind of crowdsourced samples we have to total estimates. And so we're going to continue to work on that foundation of point counters that we can use to complement crowdsourcing.
Thank you, Sean. Sean Coe, is there anything that you would like to leave the audience with today?
Yeah, I'll echo what Sean Turner has said. So, there's a lot of new methods available to capture bicycle, pedestrian, and vehicle trips. And, big data is one of them. But at the end of the day, we can build all the models that we want, but we need some sort of ground truth counters out there to, provide some way to calibrate the metrics and to scale them to the appropriate local conditions. So, I think that the big data offers to maybe reduce the number of counters that could be available or needed, or the need for, going out and looking at maintenance. But yeah, it will benefit everyone to have high quality counters that are installed correctly, calibrated correctly, and then maintained, just at key locations throughout your community.
Thank you, Sean. And Sarah Searcy.
Sorry, trying to find my mute button. I think for me, there's this research I'm involved with shows that there's no one kind of silver bullet or one gold standard data set in many cases for understanding how everybody's moving and how everybody's trying to get to their destinations. For this study, the FRA data set shows one piece of the puzzle, one piece of the picture as related to crashes. But the data that we're collecting with these thermal cameras is really getting at the everyday activity, and it becomes a much more representative picture of access and how folks are choosing their routes based on a shortest path or a level of efficiency that may typically be given to motor vehicles. And so, really thinking about the human level, really thinking about the level of the person, and making sure as we balance the needs across all different modes, and that we remember people too.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Well, at this time, we will go ahead and close out. So on behalf of ICE and NAMIC, I would like to thank our speakers for taking the time today to present and share what's going on in their cities with us. That does bring us to the conclusion of today's